Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel and to another video, and in this one I'm going to be working on painting a monochromatic painting, and I'm going to be doing a portrait of Nancy from Stranger Things. I am in a Stranger Things craze at the moment. I did 11 from Stranger Things in a recent YouTube video, and now I'm going to paint Nancy. And so I'm just going to be using a dark blue colour for this, and we're going to get a variety of shades by adding more or less water. And so I just mixed up 3 colours to make my perfect colour that I wanted. I used Payne's Grey, a bit of black and turquoise to give it more of a blue pop as well. And I found that that was a really nice colour. I made sure to test it out on a bit of scrap paper first, because it normally does look different when it's applied to paper than it does when it's just wet in the pan. So that's a little tip for you guys. Make sure you test your paint before you apply it to your actual painting. And so once I figured out what colour I wanted and I mixed it up, I wanted to see the variety of shades and the variety of values I could get just using this one colour. So I went in and I created some swatches, starting off with that really thick paint that I'd mixed up, and then gradually adding more and more water into the little palette to get lighter values. And this is a way that you can go from dark to light by adding more water. And if you want to go from light to dark, you just add more paint. The way I'm going to be doing it throughout this painting is I'm not going to be adding more water to my paint. I'm going to keep it this thick dark paint. I'm just going to be picking up less of it onto my brush if I want a lighter value, and then if I want a really dark saturated value, then I will have more paint on my brush. It'll make sense when I start the painting in a minute. But you can see that by adding more and more water, you can get a really large variety of values and different colours just using this one. And you may be thinking, well, what's the point of doing a monochromatic painting? Well, I find that especially for beginners, this is a really great one for you to do and practice, because you don't have to worry about mixing lots of different colours. All you're doing here is you're focusing on your values. And that can be a key mistake that I see beginners make, is that they don't have enough contrast in their paintings, which means that it doesn't really have much depth and it doesn't pop as much as it could. So this exercise will really help train you to use different values and to use the full range of the value scale, which can be hard to do when you're using tons of different colours. So now that I've done my swatches and we can see the variety of different values we can get from this one colour, let's go ahead and start the painting process. I'm going to be starting off by painting in the background, and in the reference the background was very much this woodland sort of, well, she's in the woods. So I'm going to be doing a very loose wet on wet technique for the background, and I'm just going to block in a few trees and some markings for the ground. Now to do this, I start off by pre-wetting the whole of the left side of the background. I'm going to do it in 2 sections so that I don't have to rush too much. And the water that I applied first, you can see it's actually quite dirty, and this acts as a really light wash of that blue colour. So I'm just going to start to go in, and I haven't got much paint on my brush. That's how I get those lighter values. And then when I'm getting in these darker bits of paint for the ground, I'm using a bit more paint on my brush to get in those dark values. And so when I'm painting in the trees, I'm doing nice vertical curves, vertical strokes to give the look of trees. I do want this to be very loose and expressive still, and I want the background to be quite blurred out, so I'm not adding too much detail. But when I do the ground, I'm going horizontally instead, so that we've got the obvious difference between those 2 areas, between the trees and the ground. I then start to work on the other side, repeating the exact same process, just going through and adding more and more paint to get in more trees and more of the ground. And as the paint disperses and bleeds out, it will look lighter in value. So you may need to go back in and darken up the colours even more by picking up even more paint onto your brush. Now I really loved how this background turned out. I love the wet and wet technique because of how much it bleeds out and gives a really soft diffused look, and you don't get any harsh edges. Now I know a lot of beginners find the wet and wet technique really difficult, so I'm planning on doing a video soon where I go through lots of watercolour techniques and the common mistakes that mean that why they don't work for you, kind of thing. So let me know if you do want to see that. So once again, I'm going back in and darkening things up even more, and I just sprinkle a little bit of salt onto that background just to add a really cool effect to it. Now, just before we move on to painting the portrait, if you do want to see the full real-time tutorial for this piece, then it is available over on my Patreon in real time. I also provide the reference, sketch outline, and the materials list for every single tutorial series so that you really can follow along with me. Over on my Patreon, I have got over 300 real-time tutorials for you guys, which you can get instant access to once you sign up. And these are not only for watercolor, but for color pencil, charcoal, pastels, and markers as well. So you really can find something on there to suit your needs. So if you do want to improve your drawing or painting skills, then I recommend checking out my Patreon. I'll leave a link at the top of the description. Before I actually start to go in and paint the portrait, I do want to use my masking fluid pen, and this is the Monochrome pen, and I'm going to use this to mask off a couple of the main highlights. So she has got two bright highlights in her eyes, and also I masked off her earring and a few of the stripes on her shirt as well. And once that has dried, I'm going to go in and start to work on painting the skin. So like I did with the background, I'm going to pre-wet the whole of her face apart from the eyes, but I do go over the nose and the mouth, and I also wet over the neck as well. And I'm going to just let that dry to act as a first base layer, because like I said, with the water it's quite dirty, so it acts as a very light wash of colour. I then wet her fur collar, and I'm going to start to work on the clothing. So I had an idea for this fleece collar, and I wanted to add salt to it, and I wanted it to give that cool texture that resembles fleece and is still quite expressive and cool looking though. So I just went in with the wet and wet technique, added a couple of shadows to where the shadows on the collar was in the reference image, and then I just simply went in and I sprinkled salt all over the collar. And you'll start to see that as that dries, it creates a really interesting effect that gives the look of that woolen fleece as well. And then I repeated the exact same technique over on the other collar. So once again, just wetting it and dropping in shadows. When I wanted the darker shadows, I used more paint as well. And I finished that off with a bit more salt. You can already see that effect starting to form on the left collar, and you can see how interesting it looks, and it gives a realistic looking texture while still being very expressive, if that makes sense. Now I just go in and I'm painting in the rest of the clothing. So she had on a shirt and then a dark jumper over the top and then her jacket. So I just went in and I just loosely painted all of that in, but we can add more details later on. And I'm going to start to work now on the face. So I pre-wetted the whole area again so that we can use our wet on wet technique, and I'm going to start to block in the shadows. And because we've wet the whole of the face, all of these colours are going to bleed out. So when we add the shadows, it's not going to look harsh. It's going to bleed out and give a soft look because it's going to bleed out into the water that we've added. So in the reference, she had darker shadows on her cheekbones, under her lips and along her jawline, and also along the side of the head as well by the hair. So I just closely looked at the reference and marked in the shadows. Also, she did have this really dark shadow around her eyes as well. And I made sure to work quickly whilst the paper was still wet. As soon as the paper starts to dry, make sure you stop, let it dry, and then you can pre-wet it again and carry on. But as the paper dries, it's going to bleed out less and less. So you could start to get more dramatic and harsh edges around where you add the shadows. And with a portrait, you want everything to look super soft. I then went and added in a base layer for the neck, and because the whole of the neck in general was darker, I could go in and add a darker wash of colour to the whole area. And then I went in with a lot more paint on my brush just to add in some shadows. I'm also going to use my Arteza brush pen, and I'm using that to get in some shading on the mouth and on the nose before I start to work on the hair. But we haven't finished with the nose or the lips yet. I just got in a base value, and I also went in and I kind of darkened up the center of the lips as well. With the hair, I wanted it to look really cool and expressive. I wanted it still to look like hair, but I didn't want it to be super realistic. So I just simply started off by going in and adding a base wash of colour to the whole of the hair, making sure still to go with the direction the hair was going in. And then I went in with more paint on my brush to create these shadows. And as I blocked in these darker values, I did make sure to go with the direction that each section of hair was going in. And I gradually got more and more intense, and I even mixed in a little more black into my paint so that I could get a really intense colour. Now I'm doing this whilst the paper is still fairly wet so that it does bleed out a little bit as well. Now to make it look even more expressive, I did get a lot of clean water on my brush and I just started to dab it throughout the hair, particularly over those really dark areas. And as this bleeds out, it's going to give a really cool starry effect because the water's going to run and it's just going to create a really interesting effect as it starts to dry, which you'll see now. You can see it's created this really nice cool starry effect to it. I also wanted to build up even more layers on the skin. I do work in a lot of layers, especially when I do a portrait, so I can build up the shadows more and more. And I use a lot more of this layering technique when I'm using a lot of colours as well. And I'm just intensifying the shadows even more because it's hard to judge what the colours are going to look like once they've dried, as watercolours do dry lighter than they look when they're wet. So you may think you've gone dark enough, but then once the paper has dried and you look at it, you may realise that you need to add another layer to darken it up even further. That happens a lot with me. I'm now starting to go in and I'm just getting in the details at this point. So I'm going around the eyes, and you want to make sure the skin is completely dry before you start to work on the eyes. Otherwise it's all going to bleed into each other and it's just going to be a complete mess. So make sure that you wait for everything to dry before you start to add details to the main features. So I fill in the iris and around the eye as well, and I darken up the eyebrow, and now I'm using my water brush pen by Arteza just to fill in the top upper lip with a darker colour, and I'm darkening up the centre line of the mouth as well, and also underneath the lips to add that shadow. Now with the nose, the tip of the nose was the darkest part, and by the nostrils, and also a little bit by the side of the nose. So I just got in those shadows, and I'm also going in and darkening up the inside of the ear as well. Then I waited for that to completely dry, and it's time to remove that masking fluid. A little tip that I have for you guys when removing masking fluid is to use a tea towel. It just makes it so much easier to remove if you use a tea towel than using your hands. I'm then going to add some more details using a black watercolour pencil, and this is a Faber-Castell Albrecht Duer, I think that's how you pronounce it, watercolour pencil, and I'm just using that to add details around the eyes and also the nose and the mouth. Now what I love about watercolour pencils is that you can add details and then activate it with water, and you can see that the pencil looks fairly grainy and not too dark at the moment, but once you go over it and start to add some water, you can see how much the colour gets darker and it just stands out so much more just by activating it with water. So this is great because you can have more control over getting in some details, but you can still get that nice dark intense look that you want just by adding a little bit of water. So not only do I darken up the facial features, but as you've seen, I added in a few lines throughout the hair as well. Next, it's time to finish off this painting with a few highlights. I do this in all of my paintings. I use white gouache by Winsor & Newton in the shade Permanent White, and I'm using this to basically highlight all of the brightest parts of the reference. I'm starting off with the eyes, and I'm highlighting the waterline, the main highlight in the eye that we masked off, and also the eyelid. And then I'm highlighting the right hand side of her face that had more light hitting it, and also adding a couple of highlights on the lips and the nose as well. And I will start to add in some highlights throughout the hair to give it a really cool, interesting effect, as well as a few splatters as well. And when I'm doing this, I wanted the highlights to be super bright, so I didn't mix in much water at all. With gouache, the more water that you guys mix in, the more translucent it's going to be. So if you really want your paint to be opaque, then make sure that you don't mix in too much water. Only mix in a little bit to be able to get it to move freely onto the paper. Like I said, I'm just going to finish off by tapping the back of my brush to get in a few little splatters. But that is it for this painting. Here you can see the final result. It was really fun to work with one colour and not have to worry about rushing and mixing up all these different colours whilst using the wet on wet technique. I love the different effects that I used with the salt and adding in spatters. I think it created a really nice cool look to the painting. Let me know in the comment section what you guys think about doing monochromatic paintings. Have you ever done them in the past before, or do you want to try them out now? I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you're new around here, and even tick that bell icon so you do get notified on my future videos. But that is it from me, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye everybody.